Hey guys, what's going on? It's Kodiak here, and today I want to provide you with a complete overview of the Emerald Nightmare raid. Now, if at any point in the video you'd like to jump to a specific boss, please click the image on your screen. Now, the Emerald Nightmare is a non-linear raid where players will encounter 7 bosses of varying difficulties. After defeating Nythendra, the first boss, your raid team can choose one of 4 paths to pursue, each ending at a different boss. Now, for the sake of this video, I will explain the bosses in the order Exiled Power took them down, and my recommended path to you. Once you've defeated the 4 middle bosses, you can pursue Cenarius and Xavius, the final bosses of the raid. So let's jump right in. This will not be a complete guide of each encounter. Instead, I will focus on the core mechanics of the fight and provide you with a snapshot of how your raid can tackle each encounter. First up, let's talk about Nythendra, a dragon found in the clutch of corruption. Players must defeat Nythendra to reach the other bosses within the Emerald Nightmare. Now, Nythendra is a 2-phase encounter that requires moderate raid coordination and movement. The core mechanics of the fight revolves around Infested Ground, a green pool that forms through a variety of debuffs and boss mechanics. Nythendra will cast Infested Breath at a random target twice a phase, when she reaches 50 energy and 100 energy. The breath causes uncontrollable infested ground patches to appear in the area of the room where she is breathing. Because the mechanic is pretty much uncontrollable, we recommend breaking the room into quarters. By doing this, you can move your way around the room, avoiding the breath and keeping space free to handle the other mechanics. Now, Nythendra also has a debuff called Rot, which targets a random player throughout the fight. Rot's targets will cause pulsing AoE damage and drop an infested ground pool when the debuff falls off. If you have a defensive cooldown, a good strategy is to pop that CD towards the end of the debuff and stack the pools together, creating more space to maneuver. Now, tanks are also hit with a similar ability called Volatile Rot. After 8 seconds, the debuff explodes, dealing raid-wide damage. The damage taken by the raid is reduced based on how far away you are from the tank. Tanks should taunt swap, pop a CD, and book it to a designated spot to drop their debuff in subsequent infested ground. Now, after the second infested breath, Nythendra will collapse, signaling the start of Phase 2, Heart of the Swarm. By this point, half the room should be covered in infested ground, and the other half should be clear. During this phase, Nythendra will begin to draw all the infested ground patches towards her, absorbing the pools and removing them from the encounter area. Players that are hit by the infested ground will start to take damage from the debuff. Now, during this phase 2, bugs will begin to spawn around the room. During the phase, random bugs will begin to grow and eventually explode. A fully grown bug will explode 3 times, causing massive AoE damage to anyone within 8 yards. Move away from them and nuke down Nythendra. Now, if you're tackling Nythendra on Heroic, 2 things change. Nythendra's tail will now lash out at raiders standing behind her, and new Infested debuff will also begin to stack up depending on how much plague damage you take. This debuff is cleared after Heart of the Swarm, so healers have to be on point. After that, Nythendra really becomes a rinse and repeat encounter. Divide the room into quarters, move as a team, handle the infested ground, and avoid exploding bugs, and you will down this infested dragon in no time. Next, I'd recommend heading towards Ursoc, a fairly straightforward fight that requires a bit of raid coordination and a moderate amount of movement. To get to Ursoc, take the Grizzly Hills portal in the main room. Now, Ursoc has been part of Warcraft lore for some time. He is an ancient guardian, one of several demigods that were among the first living creatures to roam Azeroth. His encounter is all about managing a string of 4 abilities: Focus, Charge, Slam, Debuff. To mitigate damage from the boss, the focus target should run to the middle of the room, at least 30 yards away from the boss. The raid should split into 2 groups to handle the charge. Group A should position themselves between the boss and the focus target. The more targets Ursoc hits on his way to the focused target, the less damage everyone takes. Finally, the debuff. After soaking a charge, you will get a debuff called Momentum, which will force you to switch soak groups. This is easily handled by having an evenly split A group and B group. Tanks will also have to deal with some nasty abilities. Overwhelm and Rend Flesh cannot be applied to the same tank, so taunt swap accordingly and call out for healing CDs if needed. The final ability you have to look out for is an AoE attack called Roaring Cacophony. Players standing within 25 yards of the boss split the damage, so move in close and help spread the damage amongst the raid. Each time he roars, Ursoc will gain a stack of Echoing Discord, which buffs the damage of the subsequent cacophony by 10% per stack. Now, Ursoc is one of the few bosses in the Emerald Nightmare that has an enrage mechanic. At 30%, Ursoc will enter a blood frenzy, dealing 20% increased damage and attacking 25% faster. I recommend popping Lust, lining up your offensive cooldowns, and going nuts on the boss at that time. Now, if you're tackling Ursoc on the heroic difficulty, you'll have to deal with a new mechanic folded into the Roaring Cacophony. Every time Ursoc roars, he will spawn a nightmare image at his position. This image is stationary and cannot be attacked. A 20-yard pool will form on the ground and must be avoided to prevent raid-wide damage. Tanks simply drag Ursoc around the room and avoid the roaring images, and the raid will be just fine. If you can dodge, dip, dive, and dodge Ursoc's abilities, this Corrupted Guardian won't be a problem and you'll be collecting your rewards in no time. Next, let's take a look at Il'gynoth, or the Evil Tree as he's often referred to online. To get to Il'gynoth, players should take a portal to Ungoro Crater. The Evil Tree is a true ad fight combining mechanics from encounters such as Blast Furnace and Hellfire Assault, our two favorite fights. The fight requires moderate movement, heavy coordination, and a little bit of patience, so let's dive in. Il'gynoth is a two-phase encounter. The first phase begins outside the tree with the raid team handling waves of adds. So let's look at each of these adds that we'll be facing in kill priority order. Deathglare Tentacles. They fire a Mind Flay at random targets and can be interrupted. They cause moderate damage and should be nuked down immediately. If targeted consistently, players should consider popping a defensive cooldown to help out the healers. Next up, we have the Corruptor Tentacles, which cast Spew Corruption on random non-tank targets. Targets affected by the corruption will begin to spawn small patches of corruption under their feet. Simply run out of the way of the raid and towards the edge of the room to avoid crippling your raid's movement. Feel free to pop a defensive cooldown and overlap the corruption pools for ultimate efficiency. The next ad we want to focus on are the Dominator Tentacles. These ads must be tanked and cast a Ground Slam on the target. Now, the Ground Slam seems to favor a melee DPS, so consider sticking a hard-hitting melee DPS on each tentacle with the tank and turning them away from the raid. Tanks will also want to use an active mitigation to lessen the blow from Nightmarish Fury. The last ad we need to talk about is the Nightmare Horror. The walking string beans need to be tanked and cast lasers out of their eyes in a frontal cone. Now, these eye blasts put a stacking debuff on the tank, increasing subsequent damage from eye beams by 50%, so I'd recommend taunt swapping at around 3 stacks. Nightmare Horrors also drop corruption pools under their feet every 5 seconds, so tanks will need to move them around to avoid taking additional damage from the corruption. Now, I recommend moving the Horror away from the raid first and slowly kiting it back towards the tree, because when the Horror dies, he'll spawn Ichors. And Ichors we're going to talk about in a few seconds here, but that's a great way for your tanks to be able to kite those adds and bring them close to the eyeball. Now, although it seems like it's threatening, this is actually the lowest kill priority target and should be nuked down last due to the potential raid wiping abilities of the other mobs. Now, once each of these adds are killed, they'll spawn Nightmare Ichors. These targets fixate on random members of the raid and are crucial to getting it to phase 2. If you're targeted, kite the Ichors to the base of the tree, right beneath the giant eyeball. Nuke them down and avoid the explosions that happen once the Ichors reach 0 health. Once enough Ichors have exploded, the eyeball will allow you entry into the base of the tree. Now, you must kill off all adds before entering the tree. Any Ichors that enter the tree will explode, dealing raid-wiping damage, so kill them off quick and then enter the tree. Once inside, pop Lust in any offensive cooldowns and go absolutely nuts on the heart. You have 50 seconds to do as much damage as possible before exiting the heart chamber. If you're caught inside, you will be instantly killed. Now, while in the chamber, 6 players will be targeted with Cursed Blood. Raiders must run to the edge of the chamber to avoid dealing heavy damage to the raiders caught within the radius of the blast. After exiting the chamber, you re-enter phase 1 and begin to kill adds again. The fight becomes a rinse and repeat, and once you have killed the Heart of Il'gynoth, the fight is over. If you're tackling this on heroic difficulty, nothing changes. Just remember that adds become harder to kill due to increased health pools, and hit a hell of a lot harder, so kill priority becomes a crucial element of raid success. Now, I will recommend one thing. If your raid DPS is high enough, you can stay in the tree and do phase 2 in one go. You don't need to go back into phase 1. You will want to get flasks, food, and potions to be able to do this successfully until you get the gear to do it in one phase. But if you can't, no big deal. Hop back out before the 50 seconds are up, do phase 1 again, and you'll kill it in 2 phases. Kill the ads in the proper order, kite the corruptions out of the raid, interrupt the I-beams, and nuke the heart, and your raid will cleanse the corruption from this evil tree. Up next, I'd recommend heading towards the Dragons of Nightmare, a complicated fight on paper, but in my opinion, one of the most doable fights in the entire raid. To access the Dragons of Nightmare, players should take the Emerald Dreamway portal at the end of the northeastern path from the Core of Nightmares. The Dragon's encounter takes place in the Emerald Nightmare, a corrupted version of the Emerald Dreamway. In this fight, players will encounter dragons that used to be world bosses until the Cataclysm revamp of Azeroth's zones. Nythendra, the only remaining living Emerald Dragon, is joined by the nightmare versions of her fallen allies, Emrys, Lethon, and Terror. On LFR, normal, and heroic difficulties, only 3 of these dragons are active each week. Nythendra will always be present, and the remaining 2 dragons will be selected at random each raid lockout. The first thing we'll have to do is split the raid team into even groups, 1 split to the left of the encounter area and 1 split to the right. The dragons have a shared health pool, so splitting up the raid doesn't really result in split damage. Each dragon brings something unique to the table, but let's first talk about the overall flow of the fight. At 70% and 40%, the non-Nythendra dragon will take flight, while another dragon circling overhead will land in the encounter area. This acts as a natural tank swap spot due to the debuff applied by the dragon. The reason the raid splits is because of the dragon's mark. Each dragon has a unique mark that stacks, and at 10 stacks, a debilitating effect occurs, often resulting in a raid wipe. To avoid reaching 10 stacks of mark, tanks need to swap at around 7 or 8 stacks depending on the efficiency of the taunt swap. Instead of both dragons moving to the middle of the room, the more mobile tank should run towards the center of the encounter space and taunt the other dragon away, resulting in a much cleaner transition. Ranged and melee DPS need to be patient during the swap and avoid pulling directly after the taunt swap, or increasing stacks become a point of carelessness. Each dragon has a frontal cone ability called Corrupted Breath. Tanks should be careful to only swap after both dragons have used the ability to avoid raid-wide damage. Now, I mentioned this fight is complicated on paper, and if you want to dive deeper into each of the dragon's abilities, I'd recommend looking up a complete guide. But the fight can be summed up like this: kill the ads that spawn, dodge the clouds on the ground, and prevent blooms from spawning by standing on the red flowers. Healers, be prepared to throw dispels out constantly. This fight has a lot of dispellable mechanics, but the most important one is the Defiled Vines, which will trap players in place, limiting their mobility and thus resulting in increased damage taken from the other dodgeable mechanics. The only ability worth talking about is the Nightmare Blooms. Nythendra will cast Nightmare Blast at a random player's location. After the impact, a Nightmare Bloom will spawn. Blooms spawn Dread Horrors every 3 seconds if left unchecked. To deal with it, one raider simply needs to stand on the flower. This is a top priority as the ads become a quick nuisance and have the potential to overwhelm your team, especially on higher difficulties. While we're on the topic of higher difficulties, let's talk about Heroic. Each dragon applies marks faster, which means tanks need to be on point and swap dragons at 7 stacks. This ensures that the stacks don't reach the critical 10 stack point and stun the raid. On top of that, each dragon gains a new ability, thus adding to the pile of raid-wide mechanics your team will need to deal with. Nightmare Blooms become an increasing threat as they now have a damage reduction debuff to any player standing nearby, so misdirect, tricks, or taunt these ads to the tank and have your ranged DPS nuke them down. One final note is to watch out for the new fear mechanic that Terror gains while in the air, which pulls your raiders off the Nightmare Blooms and spawns Dread Horrors. This isn't the end of the world, just stay calm and regain composure after the fear is over. Stay calm, this fight is common sense. Split the dragons, kill the ads, stand in the flowers, and dispel the vines, and these nightmares of dragons will topple in no time. Next boss we're heading to is Elerethe Renferal, a very complicated 2-phase spider rock fight with a lot of movement with spider ads scattered throughout the encounter. To get to her, you will take the portal to Mulgore on the southeastern path from the Core of Nightmares. Each of her forms lasts 90 seconds, with an 8-second intermission between them. In her first phase, she's in spider form. During this phase, she'll start to cast Web of Pain, which links 2 players together and lasts 90 seconds. This mechanic links the 2 players together and reflects any damage they take to their partner. Players want to stand a maximum of 20 yards away from each other while affected with Web of Pain, or the damage will increase the further they are away from each other. So with all of the linked targets, you have to stay together. The second time she casts Web of Pain, she will choose 2 non-tank targets. Very important that you stay close together. Elerethe will also target 2 players with necrotic venom, much like the rot from Nythendra we just talked about. This draws a 7-yard circle around the player and applies a 10-second warning debuff. The mechanic really starts after the 10-second grace period. Raiders will begin to drop slime pools on the ground. Pop a defensive cooldown, stand still, or if you're out of personal cooldowns, run along the edge of the platform in a safe area until the debuff falls off. It's crucial that while you're running, you don't run over spider eggs, which will spawn little adds that you must nuke down and are a pest to deal with. Now, Phase 1 has another raid wiper called Vile Ambush. Elerethe will ascend into the air and create a swirly patch on the ground. Simply run to the other side of the platform to avoid taking massive damage from the impact when she comes back down. The further you are away, the less damage you take. Easy. When she ascends, she will spawn a few spiderlings. These spiders will drop pools of venom, which the tanks must pick up and move to the edge of the platform, away from the boss. Nuke them down and get back into the fray. When these spiders die, they will drop pools, so Raid, be ready to move away from those. This process happens a couple of times before Elerethe transforms into a rock. This is where the real fight begins. She starts by casting Volatile Winds, which functions exactly like necrotic venom, but instead of pools, you drop a tornado. After your 10-second grace period, you will drop the tornado. They need to be away from the raid in a safe location, clear of green pools. More on this in a second. After the winds have gone out, Elerethe will hit the raid with an ability called Gathering Clouds, which causes raid-wide damage and a pushback. Healers, you will definitely want to use a cooldown here to handle the increased damage. Now, this is where the fun begins. Elerethe will take off and fly to another platform, signaling an ability called Dark Storm. The raid team needs to traverse across the web bridges and reach the new platform, avoiding any tornadoes or venomous pools in the way. On your way, you may need to drag spiders that have popped over while you're running across the bridge, so tanks pick them up, move to the other platform. Speed is the key, but staying alive is more important than a mad dash across the bridge, so pop a cooldown. If you have a health potion or a health stone, make sure you're ready to use it and get across that bridge. Now, when Elerethe takes off from the platform, she'll drop a few Aviana-type feathers on the ground. Depending on your raid comp, your main tank, a couple healers, and a bunch of DPS should jump over to the new platform with the feathers. DPS that take the feathers will also have an extra action button, which acts like a ground slam skill shot. Raiders can one-shot spiders if they hit the target with the extra action ability. This will cause a venomous pool on the ground, so raids need to be careful not to hit the spiders in the path of their raid team. This is easily the most challenging part of the encounter, so healers, top your raid up and consider using a few major and perhaps a couple of minor cooldowns to keep everybody alive. If you manage to make it across the bridge, the fight continues with Volatile Winds and a tank mechanic called Raking Talons, which forces your tanks to swap in a Manaroth style, with the first tank taking the first hit and the second tank taking the second. This will help your healers and will set you up for success with the final ability, Razor Wings, a frontal cone attack that will tear your tanks to shreds without proper mitigation and tank healing. Spider or Rock, this boss is a heavy movement fight, healer intensive, and it's one of the first major challenges you'll face in the Emerald Nightmare. Don't be discouraged if you don't see immediate success. Run out of the pools or winds, avoid the ambush, and for the love of God, nail that transition, and this shape-shifting nightmare will be nothing but a bad memory. Now, one last thing of note, if you are doing this fight on Heroic, the Volatile Winds mechanic will begin to suck up venomous pools. So during the 10-second grace period, you can run over the venomous pools with the Volatile Winds debuff. After the 10 seconds is up, you will drop a tornado that will begin to move randomly throughout the encounter space. If it runs over venomous pools, it will suck them up and target your raid team, regardless of where they are on the entire encounter space. If they're on the previous platform, they'll fire all of their poison over to you on the new platform. So it's really important to drop those tornadoes away from the green pools. Next up we have Cenarius, a familiar figure in Warcraft lore. This corrupted version of the Lord of the Forest is one of the most ad-intensive fights in the raid and will challenge your team's coordination and priority killing targets. Cenarius is a two-phase encounter with moderate to heavy movement requirements. The majority of the fight is spent in first phase, where the raid will have to deal with adds approximately every 80 seconds. Phase 2 begins when Cenarius reaches 35% health, or when the 6th wave of adds has been summoned. Let's jump right in. Phase 1 is dealing with the Forces of Nightmare, an ability Cenarius uses to summon 4 types of adds. Each set of adds has a unique toolkit that your raid will have to deal with. Now, if you'd like a complete breakdown of each add, please refer to an in-depth guide on Wowhead or any other source of information for World of Warcraft. For now, I'll refer to the ads as such: Wisps, Sisters, Drakes, and Ancients. Each time Forces of Nightmare happens, Malfurion will assist your team and summon Cleansed Ground beneath one of the ad groups. These ads will turn into allies and will directly assist your team for a brief period of time. Now, your raid team is in complete control of this mechanic. Stack by the pod that you wish to cleanse and gain the benefit from your new allied minion. Again, for a complete list of how each ad assists your team, please check out a complete guide. Malfurion's Cleansed Ground acts as an important dispel of sorts. Throughout the fight, Cenarius will cast Creeping Nightmares on the raid. This debuff will stack infinitely and deal moderate to severe shadow damage to the raid depending on how many stacks a player has. To cleanse the debuff, players must stand in the Cleansed Ground. It is not imperative to stand directly in the Cleansed Ground. Players should dip into the pool and quickly get back out, as the players that soak the Cleansed Ground will actually make the pool shrink, so players have to be efficient at getting in and out on a dime. Before we talk about handling the ads, let's talk about one last ability that Cenarius has, called Nightmare Brambles. Brambles will fixate a random target and creep towards them, leaving a patch of brambles in the location every 2 seconds. Players that touch the brambles will be rooted and take heavy periodic damage. As of this video, the brambles do not have an in-game debuff associated with them, so you have to open your eyeballs and pay attention to any creeping vines moving towards your player. Healers, you can dispel the brambles that root players, but the ultimate goal is to not get hit. Players with immunities such as Divine Shield, Cloak of Shadows, Anti-Magic Cell, and others can use these cooldowns to run through several brambles and remove them. Now, one thing Cenarius does have is an Aura of Dread Thorns, which buffs all enemies within 20 yards, including Cenarius. This buff acts as you would imagine, reflecting 50% of all damage dealt back at the attacker. The ad tank must avoid bringing enemies close to Cenarius. This will ensure the buff does not reach the additional enemies. DPS should be careful about multi-dotting and attacking Cenarius during Thorns, as the damage will quickly overwhelm the healers, and subsequently the raid. On heroic difficulty, this ability extends out to 30 yards, so tanks have to be extra vigilant about pulling ads away from the boss. Now, let's take a look at the ads and how to handle them. As with most fights, the key is killing the highest priority ads first and executing any actions necessary to negate the ad's most deadly ability. Depending on which group you plan to cleanse, there's a certain order that I recommend going in. I recommend killing any Wisps first, Sisters next, Drakes next, and finally the Ancients last. Although each group has a series of abilities, it can be broken down like this: Kite the Wisps, stun the Sisters, move from the Drake, and stack on the Ancient. If you can remember that simple mantra, your raid team will breeze through phase 1. Now, on heroic difficulty, the Sister gains a slight debuff, so pay extra attention to stunning them as a priority. Phase 2 is a standard burn phase with a couple of twists. Cenarius will cast Spear of the Nightmares at the current tank, dealing extremely heavy damage. In conjunction with the spear, a pool of nightmare begins to form at the tank's feet, dealing moderate damage every second a player is standing in the area. The size of the pool is dependent on how much damage the tank took from the spear, so either pop a defensive cooldown or coordinate with your healers to keep the pool as small as possible. Spears will also apply a debuff that prevents tanks from taking 2 hits in a row, so tanks swap as necessary. Tanks must move Cenarius around the room to avoid raid-wide damage from the nightmare pools. Try overlapping pools as best as possible to make the most out of the limited encounter area. Finally, let's talk about ending this fight. Pop Lust at 35% at the beginning of phase 2 and DPS nuke the boss down. Keep an eye out for Malfurion, who will periodically get rooted by Cenarius. If Malfurion is rooted, he will be prevented from casting Cleansed Ground, and your stacks of Creeping Nightmare will get out of control. Ads will no longer spawn in this phase, but your raid team will still have to deal with brambles, so spatial awareness is key to being successful in phase 2. The strategy at 35% is kill Cenarius as fast as possible while making good use out of the limited encounter area and keeping an eye out for brambles or roots on Malfurion. Kill the ads in the proper order, cleanse your Creeping Nightmare, avoid the brambles, and move the boss out of the nightmare, and your team will break this Lord of the Forest. Now we've arrived at the final boss of the raid, Xavius, a twisted satyr, the Lord of the Emerald Nightmare. Xavius can only be accessed after players defeat Cenarius. His encounter is located in the Rift of Alm, a shadowy, surreal chamber beneath the roots of the nightmare-corrupted Shalda World tree. The encounter space is one of a kind, with no clear boundaries. The darkness that creeps in at the edge of the lighter central circle is a vague indicator of the encounter area. Players who cross through the shadowy boundary into the infinite dark beyond will take extremely heavy damage until they return to the center of the Rift of Aln. Xavius is all about managing your corruption. Corruption is gained through several of Xavius' abilities, and at certain thresholds, players will begin to hallucinate new mechanics that only they can see. It's important not to gain corruption too fast, as these additional mechanics deal heavy damage on top of an already hectic fight. At 33 corruption or higher, players will have to deal with Crushing Shadows, a ground slam mechanic that players must avoid or risk taking fatal damage. A pink reticle on the ground will indicate the slam's location, so simply run away to avoid taking massive damage. At 66 corruption or higher, players will have to deal with Unfathomable Reality. Small pink reticles will spawn on the ground, and after 3 seconds, a plume of flames will erupt from the targeted location, dealing damage to players within 6 yards of the eruption. When players reach 100 corruption, they will be affected by Descent into Madness, which at first buff players for 20 seconds, increasing damage and healing by 150%. Once the buff wears off, however, players will transform into a Creature of Madness and will be mind controlled. Creatures of Madness must be killed, taking viable DPS and resources away from managing Xavius and his mechanics. If you hit 100 corruption in the final phase of the encounter, I recommend putting everything you have into Xavius, avoiding the ads and focusing all DPS on the race against time. For the most part, corruption generating abilities can be avoided, but some sources are unavoidable. Solid raid execution and proper strategy can help your team avoid racking up corruption too high. On normal difficulty, your stacks of corruption will begin to decay, so this should help players avoid reaching the 100 corruption too quickly. Players are not alone in dealing with Xavius. Twice during the encounter, Dream of Ysera will spawn and send half of the raid team into the Dream, allowing them extra leeway in managing their corruption. Players will be sent into the Dream at 95% health and again at 60% health. This is the start of Phase 1 and 2. Phase 3 has no Dream. Ysera takes an even split of the raid team into the Dream each time, so players will always see the Dream mechanic at some point in the encounter. The first thing to mention is that players in the Dream will have their corruption erased once they exit the Dream. Additionally, any cooldowns used and mana spent during the Dream are refunded when the player enters back into reality. The Dream will last for 3 minutes, or will end if a player takes fatal damage or would be mind controlled after reaching 100 corruption. However, players that do reach 100 corruption will still benefit from the Descent into Madness buff before exiting the Dream. Players in the Dream act as a buffer between the boss and the players in reality, shielding players from taking extra corruption. Tanks within the Dream will have to taunt the Corruption Horror, as well as taunt Xavius during his Nightmare Infusion ability, which empowers the boss's melee attacks and applies a healthy chunk of corruption. On heroic difficulty, this ability can last up to 18 seconds, causing a massive amount of damage on the Dream tank and applying a serious amount of corruption. Healers and tanks must be aware of this ability and react accordingly. Healers in the Dream are the primary dispellers of the encounter and should focus primarily on dealing with the tank debuff. DPS have a few things to look out for. First, players in the Dream should intercept lurking terrors, which will fixate on a player in reality. Dreaming players just need to put themselves between the terror and the player fixated in reality, or simply run into the mob as it chases the fixated target. Players will also have to help soak Corruption Meteors, which deal a split amount of damage and corruption to all players standing inside the reticle. Finally, DPS will have to soak Tainted Discharge pools, which spawn after inconceivable horrors die in Phase 2. The goal within the Dream is to protect the raid as much as possible from corruption gains and prolong your stay in the Dream so that you reach 100 corruption and gain the Descent into Madness throughput buff. Use cooldowns liberally to help defeat ads and heal through heavy raid damage. Now, back in reality, Xavius is a 3-phase encounter. In Phase 1, 2 players will be targeted with an ability called Nightmare Blaze, which will create a line between 2 players, and after a short delay will send a massive spiked blade through the 2 players. If targeted with this ability, move to the side of the room and avoid pathing the mechanic through your raid team. Players will also have to deal with 2 types of ads in Phase 1, Lurking Terrors and Corruption Horrors. Lurking Terrors spawn on random raid members and will begin to fixate on the target. Run away from the raid and kite the mob until a member of the Dream intercepts the ad. When the ad is soaked, the terror will cast Tormenting Infection on the player that took the damage, which will result in a stack of 15 corruption. On occasion, Xavius will cast Manifest Corruption, summoning a Corruption Horror instead of a Terror. This new mob is the priority target and must be killed quickly. The Dreaming Tank should taunt this mob and turn it away from the raid, stacking near Xavius to allow players to cleave onto the boss. This mob has a few abilities that will add unavoidable corruption to players, so nuke this target down as soon as possible. Finally, a note for the tanks in Phase 1. Tanks will have to deal with a stacking debuff called Darkening Souls, which will deal heavy periodic damage. This ability applies to the current tank approximately every 8 to 10 seconds. This ability can only be removed by a dispel from the healers, so Dream healers should coordinate with tanks to clear the debuff. Take a note that you will have 25 corruption after dispelling the tank, so make sure you don't cap your corruption too early in the Dream. Before the debuff is dispelled, tanks must run away from the raid. Anyone within 25 yards of the tank during the dispel will take heavy damage. Once Xavius reaches 65% health, he will enter Phase 2. 3 new mechanics will challenge your team: Inconceivable Horrors, Corruption Meteors, and Bonds of Terror. Let's start with the simple mechanics. Bonds of Terror. Players targeted by this ability must run together to clear the bonds and stop the pulsing periodic damage associated with the debuff. Next, we have Corruption Meteors. I recommend having a stack point right behind the boss. The player targeted with the meteor should run to the mark, and players in the Dream should stack within the reticle to help dissipate the damage and corruption associated with the ability. Healers feel free to use a cooldown to recover from the damage caused by the meteor. Players not within the Dream should avoid the meteor at all costs due to the increased corruption this ability puts on players. Finally, let's talk about the adds in Phase 2. When Xavius reaches 100 energy, approximately every 40 seconds, he will spawn a number of Inconceivable Horrors based on the side of the raid. These adds spawn at the edge of the encounter area and begin to walk towards Xavius. Ranged and melee should switch to the adds and nuke them down to avoid an ability called Dark Ruination. Horrors that reach the boss will empower Xavius to emanate waves of damage every section, as well as stacks of corruption. Use slows, stuns, and CC abilities to avoid disempowerment at all costs. Now, when a horror dies, a pool of tainted discharge will spawn on the floor. Players in the Dreams should soak the pool and help clear the encounter area. Players that soak the pool will gain 4 corruption, so be mindful of that. Tanks will have to deal with a new debuff in Phase 2 called Blackening Souls, which acts similarly to Darkening Souls in Phase 1. To avoid fatal damage, tanks should swap around 3 or 4 stacks. Blackening Soul can only be removed with a dispel, so tanks should coordinate with healers to clear the debuff. When a tank is dispelled, a pool of discharge forms at their feet, so move away from the raid before you dispel. We've arrived at the final phase, World of Darkness. This is more or less a hectic burn phase. The raid must defeat Xavius before players turn into creatures of madness, causing wipes. Lost Hero time warp during this phase and pop all of your strong CDs as soon as he hits 30%. In Phase 3, Xavius will gain a few new abilities. At 100 energy, he will cast Writhing Deep, which summons a few nightmare tentacles around the encounter space. Although the final phase of this fight is a race against a clock, tanks should bring Xavius around the room near nightmare tentacles to allow players to cleave onto them. Tentacles will cast Nightmare Bolts at random raid members every 3 seconds. Nightmare Bolts will apply 3 stacks of corruption on the target, so striking a good balance between boss damage and tentacle damage is key. Xavius will continue to use Nightmare Blades and Corruption Meteor in Phase 3, as well as a tanking debuff, Blackening Soul, so raiders will have to deal with each mechanic as they were in Phases 1 and 2. There are no more raiders in the Dream in Phase 3, so everyone needs to stack up, split the damage from the Corruption Meteor. It is very likely that the multiple players will reach 100 corruption during this phase. If a player does get mind controlled, the raid will have to decide whether or not to kill the target or ignore or stun them to keep attacking Xavius. Phase 3 is all about striking a balance between boss damage and add damage. If your raid can handle everything Xavius has to throw at your team, you will cleanse the corrupted nightmare from the heart of the world tree and reap the rewards you so rightly deserve. And that's it, guys. Those are the strategies you need to know for the Emerald Nightmare. If you notice something that we missed or have an alternate strategy for a boss, leave a comment below. Like we said, this is not a complete guide of every single encounter, but more or less a snapshot of each boss on normal and heroic difficulty. If you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to ask me or any of the Raiders in Exiled Power. If you're new to the channel and enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe for more content throughout Legion. My name is Kodiak, Raid Leader of Exiled Power, the premier 2-day raid guild on Arthas, and we'll see you next time.